So what is, in your opinion, the best definition of masculinity?
So, Raewyn Connell is a scholar who's actually in Australia, and she provides a definition of hegemonic masculinity. So, when she talks about hegemonic masculinity, what she's talking about is two aspects of that. One is idealized forms of masculinity. So if you think about our culture, what I think about is things like masculinity being defined around physical strength, right? Around whiteness, ability, financial stability, familial patriarchy, heterosexuality. So there's this way in which we perpetuate a certain ideology about masculinity.
Glam rock as a genre is often most recognizable by its extravagant costumes and the flamboyant stage presence of artists in the genre. Do you think this is contrary to, supportive of, or irrelevant to masculinity?
So, I'm going to draw something. So my colleague, Carrie Jean Soika, who's usually next door, talks about masculinity these ways. I am not an artist, so let's see how well this works out. So, if you think about three circles, right? And so if we talk about masculinity, we talk about like male bodies, right? And then if we talk about men in terms of gender. And a lot of times when we talk about these three, we're thinking actually of how all that intersects, right? So when I talk about hegemonic masculinity, a lot of it is about how these three are supposed to come together in particular ways. But we can talk about masculinity in different ways. So thinking about glam rock without actually knowing a lot about it, right? We could talk about how there's different types of masculinity. So there's hegemonic masculinity, which is that idealized form. And then there's subordinate masculinities, right? Which are people who try to achieve that hegemonic masculinity but fail for different reasons. When I think of glam rock, what I think of is basically these types of subordinate masculinities. There's also another way to think of that, and that is contested masculinity. So I know a little bit about David Bowie, right? So I would actually argue that he contests masculinity in some ways, that hegemonic masculinity. So he actually tries to, so bringing in aspects of femininity is one way to contest the way that this is sort of, hegemonic masculinity is sort of pushed on to people. I think there's some interesting things happen too in terms of like glam rock where, like one of the things about hegemonic masculinity that Connell talks about is that masculinity is in opposition to femininity, right? And that's how it gets framed in our society, but certainly not all societies. And so if you have this sort of framing, right, it's actually more like this, and it's a hierarchy. And so a lot of times what happens when you attempt to achieve hegemonic masculinity, you are demeaning the feminine. And so what's really interesting then about glam rock is you have people who identify as men, right, and as to varying degrees masculine, and they're bringing in sort of stereotypical aspects of femininity with like long hair, wearing makeup, certain clothes, right? What I think is interesting is that their fan base, from what I understand, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but their fan base does not necessarily view that as a negative gender variation.
See the mice in their million hordes, from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. Rule Britannia is out of bounds. We're not gonna take it. No, we ain't gonna take it. We're not gonna take it anymore. I said, Mama, we're all crazy now. I said, Mama, we're all crazy now.
Would you say that glam rock contrasted or accentuated masculinity in music?
think what glam rock does then is it actually doesn't necessarily contrast hegemonic masculinity, but I think what it does is it actually presents options to hegemonic masculinity, right? And it presents a more fluid definition of what masculinity